So you're out at the gym or the beach or wherever you go for fun, and you're just chilling, and every person you see, virtually every person you see, has a tattoo. Every single person walking by, men, women, young men and women, they all have tattoos, or most of them do anyway. And you're thinking about it, and you're thinking to yourself, well, this is definitely a new trend, but are tattoos safe? Like, I know what they are, I know how they work, they're injecting ink under the skin, but are they actually safe? Are there health effects of getting tattoos? Does it affect the immune system? Does it increase your cancer risk? Well, let's talk about the science behind that.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, all you scientists, and welcome on back to The Science Behind That podcast. I'm your host, Atticus Hamilton, and as you heard in the intro, today we're going to be discussing the science behind tattoos. We're going to be talking about not necessarily what they are, because everybody knows what a tattoo is, but we're going to be discussing things like any potential health risks associated with them, how, if at all, do they affect the immune system. We're going to be talking about tattoos and risks for lymphoma and skin cancer, and other things. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. Before we jump right in, I'd like to invite all of you to go grab yourselves a nice steaming hot cup of coffee, add a little bit of maple syrup to it, and we'll jump right in. So tattoos, we all know what they are. It's simply a process of injecting ink molecules into the dermis of the skin to create an image or words. And I know a couple years back there was that show on TV. What was it called? Ink Master. We're all familiar with tattoos. There have been really bad ones. There have been really good ones. And it is an art form. And tattoos have been around for thousands and thousands of years, from many different cultures around the world. And today we're talking about the potential health effects of it. So first, let's talk about the layers of the skin, because this is important. So in terms of deepest to most subsurface, you have your muscle layer, you have your hypodermis, your dermis, and your epidermis. And then the epidermis has multiple layers as well. I was always told to remember the epidermis as come let's get sunburned, which stands for stratum corneum, which is the outermost layer, stratum lucidium, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, stratum basal, and then that overlays the dermis. And when you're getting a tattoo, the tattoo deposits ink down past the epidermis into the dermis, because the dermis tissue is not recycled as frequently as the epidermis. The problem with the epidermis is in the basal layer, or the stratum basal, is characterized by your epidermal cells, but they're all healthy, they're still alive. And as they get older and start to die, they move up into the layers until you have your stratum corneum layer, which is all a bunch of dead cells that are filled with keratin that flake off. And so if you put ink in the epidermal layer, it would fade very quickly and disappear, basically. So that's why it's deposited in the dermis. So what's the characteristic of the dermis then? The dermis is where all of your hair follicles go. You have blood vessels there, you have nerve endings there, and then right below that is your muscle layers, and your muscle attaches it to the hypodermal layer, or the subdermal layer. So then once the ink is deposited into the dermis, what happens? Well, basically, once the ink is deposited, your immune system views these ink particles as an invading pathogenic threat. And so what they do is they send a bunch of macrophages to the site of the tattoo, and the macrophages begin breaking down the really tiny ink particles. So the bulk of the ink particles in a tattoo are too large for the macrophages to ingest, but there are tinier bits, and those macrophages, they eat that ink, and some of them go to the local lymph node where that tattoo is nearest, or where they are nearest, and then ink gets transferred into that lymph node, but most of them just stay there and die. And when they die, their bodies release the ink again, and more macrophages go and eat that released ink, and so on and so forth. And that's why, after many years, tattoos fade, because the macrophages are breaking down these ink particles and sort of diffusing it through the body, because they're never really broken down. And in fact, in a couple studies, in one study in particular, they determined that 2 hours after tattooing, ink could already be found in the localized lymph nodes around where that tattoo is. So that's not to say that if you get a tattoo, your lymph nodes will fill with ink. That's not what I'm saying, but some of it does get transported to the lymphatic system, because the macrophages that eat the ink, some of them drain from that tissue into the lymphatic ducts, and as a result, their ink gets deposited along that route. And that's going to be very important for later on in our episode when we talk about risk with skin cancer and lymphoma in particular. So remember that. But ultimately, that's what happens to the tattoo. And because the bulk of those ink particles are too big, your macrophages don't break them down. And so then when you look at something like laser tattoo removal actually just works by helping your immune system break down that ink, or at least get rid of it from the localized area. Laser tattoo removal works by pulverizing the ink particles into tiny, tiny pieces that are small enough that your macrophages are able to eat and I'm using air quotes, get rid of, because you can never really get rid of it. And when we talk about tattoos are like the internet. You can post something on the internet and delete it, but it never really goes away. And tattoos are very much the same thing. You can tattoo your skin and you can laser remove it later, but it never really goes away because the ink is always still in your body, in your physiology. So now that we know that, and the basic immunology mechanics of how that works, let's get into the other part here, which is there an effect on the immune system? Now, this is a topic that I was genuinely very curious about. Do tattoos have an effect on the immune system? Well, acutely, after you inject the ink into the person's skin, and as we said, the immune system treats it as a foreign invader, we do see an upregulation of immune response. Up to 2 hours after up to 2 hours after injection of the tattoo ink, a couple studies have shown that almost as high as an 81% higher macrophage levels than pre-tattooing, which makes sense because the body's mounting this immune response against the tattoo ink. And so right after getting tattooed, your levels of immune cells are going to be highest. And then, of course, that drops down to a certain point after several weeks and months of getting the tattoo. It takes about 4 weeks for the subsurface wound of the tattoo to heal, but it can take up to 6 months for the entire tattoo to heal itself. So after 4 weeks, you can go swimming, and after 6 months, it's fully healed. And that's just due to the body's repair mechanisms and how long that takes. But is there a systemic upregulation of immune activity? And the simple answer to that question is that we don't really know. There have been studies that have suggested that people with tattoos have a generalized upregulated immune activity systemically, and getting a tattoo in one area not only causes a rise in local levels of macrophages, but a rise in macrophages across the entire body. And then those same studies have also said that there's some evidence to suggest that tattoos can serve as basically a way to increase the effectiveness of the immune system. Just like training, through weightlifting increases the size and strength capacity of your muscles. Some studies have indicated that tattoos can increase the ability of your immune system to respond to actual pathogenic threats. However, other studies have reported that there's no change, and then some studies have reported that there's a detrimental impact. For instance, one study out of Denmark seemed to suggest that people with tattoos responded less aggressively to the COVID vaccination than people without tattoos. So the simple answer of, is it bad for the immune system or is it good? We don't really know. At the end of the day, we just don't really know because the information, the data out there is very conflicting. And the other factor here as well is there isn't a lot of research on this topic. There's research on infection risk with tattoos. There's research on a variety of other things when it comes to tattoos. But when it comes to the chronic effect of tattoos on the overall immune system health, there's just not a lot of data. And it seems like there's conflicting information. Now, going along with that same idea, there were some very interesting studies as well that have suggested that in historical human cultures, especially those that very heavily got tattooed, they may have been as a way to subconsciously signal immunological fitness. Because what is determined is that in people who are immune suppressed or immunocompromised, tattoos can be a dangerous thing because it takes energy away from their immune system to fight and I'm using air quotes again, to fight the tattoo versus fight any infection that they have. And so individuals who are immune suppressed do demonstrate a poor effectiveness at handling pathogenic infections when they also have tattoos. And that has played into some theories that, historically speaking, tattoos were a way to signal an individual's immunological fitness because their immune system was strong enough to both have a tattoo or multiple tattoos and also, fight off infection, which I thought was kind of interesting, an interesting theory. But overall, it seems like the question as to if tattoos have any positive or negative effect on the immune system for healthy individuals, it seems to still be up in the air, as there's some data that suggests there's no effect, and there's some data that suggests that there is a positive effect, but we don't really know. So then moving on to the next part here, which is, does it increase the risk of lymphoma or skin cancer? Now, this is a topic that I was particularly interested in, considering the fact that here in the United States, tattoo inks are not regulated at all. Now, I know I have a lot of viewers in Europe, and for those of you in Europe, you're in luck because the European Union has pretty decent regulations on what chemicals can be in tattoo ink, but that's not something that exists here in America. And out of many tattoo ink brands sampled in the United States, a lot of them were discovered to have benzenes, cyclohexane, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and heavy metals, and of course, known carcinogens. And it was actually kind of disturbing how many brands of inks in the United States have that, because a lot of them do. In Europe, it's a different story. Europe, the EU in particular, puts very strict regulations on what compounds can be in the tattoo inks, and they do their best to put regulations preventing any known carcinogens from being added to tattoo inks. And in fact, they've even banned certain tattoo inks in Europe because of their caustic compounds that they contain, such as Blue 17. Now, that doesn't exist here in the United States. And until 2022, as far as I could find out in my research, that also didn't exist in the UK, because with Brexit, they left the EU, and so they didn't have to follow regulations for tattoo inks. But luckily, to those of you that live in the UK, they did recently pass laws, new laws mandating what can and cannot be in these tattoo inks. But even still, with these regulations, like in Europe and the UK, European compliant tattoo inks that were sampled still were determined to contain very low levels, albeit, of heavy metals and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which do have an effect on the body if they're consumed. And same with carcinogens. You know, if we consume known carcinogens like ethidium bromide, it causes issues. You know, ethidium bromide is no longer used in the laboratory setting because of its carcinogenic behavior, which made it really good for what it did. It's an intercalating agent used for DNA amplification and gel electrophoresis, but it's no longer used because of its cancer risk. However, compounds like this in the United States can and are still found in the inks. And that raises a question. Is there any link between tattoos and lymphoma? Well, much like with the other question where, you know, what is the tattoo's effect on the immune system? There's not a lot of data. Some studies in the United States have shown a link between tattoos and skin cancer or lymphoma, and others have shown no link whatsoever. And when you think about it, it makes sense a little bit, right? Because if tattoo ink is found in the lymph nodes as soon as 2 hours after tattooing, if that ink contains carcinogens, it's theoretically possible then that the lymph nodes would be exposed to the carcinogens in the ink, even though it would be very, very low levels. So that's the important thing to remember, is a tattoo doesn't really stay just in the skin. It moves throughout the entire body. And I heard somebody describe it as living art, because it is living art. You know, if you had a tattoo 10 years ago, by now it pretty much is a truly living piece of art. It's a piece of you that's living with you in terms of in the macrophages and in the lymph nodes. The concern is there a link between skin cancer and lymphoma? And frankly, there's not a lot of data, A, and B, there's conflicting information. Some suggest there is, others suggest there isn't. The studies I found that suggest that there is had big issues with the fact that, you know, it was a small sample size and variables, lifestyle choices weren't controlled for, etc. That being said, if you are looking at getting a tattoo, because I know that now they're a pretty trendy thing, and, you know, they're kind of cool. I don't know. I think a tattoo would be kind of cool. I don't know. But if you are looking into it, I think it's important to not only making sure that the person you're doing it is bloodborne pathogen trained, making sure that the needles are sterilized, but the important thing as well is knowing what is in the ink. And luckily here in the United States, even though it's not regulated, there are more and more brands of tattoo inks that are coming out with organic or non-toxic tattoo inks. So that's always something to ask your tattoo artist about, if that's what they use or if they can use that for your tattoo. For my European audience, well, you guys are in a much better position than us Americans are in, because the tattoo industry over there is regulated. And you can be fairly rest assured that you're not going to be exposed to at least the same levels of cancer-causing compounds and heavy metals that would be in most U.S. inks. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about is, historically, I was curious. So I was doing research in cancer or lymphoma rates amongst cultures that historically have had very high rates of tattooing. And they've been generally lower on average than the developed world. However, this could be because, I don't know, maybe these cultures still use traditional inks. In traditional tattooing inks, most cultures would burn substances like nuts. Usually they would burn nuts or wood to create soot, and they'd mix the soot in with usually cane sugar or an oil, and they would use that as their tattoo ink. And one of those, and for example, that's what was done generally in Samoa, Polynesia, in most of the Middle East. Historically, those were what they used for tattooings thousands of years ago. But I couldn't find any information as to, the cancer rates in a lot of those populations. And again, it's hard to conduct studies on it when you can't control for other things like lifestyle, etc. But for the most part, in laboratory animals, tattooings have been relatively safe. So at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, tattoos may help your immune system, and they may not. They may have no effect whatsoever. And it doesn't seem like they increase your risk of lymphoma, or skin cancer. But one thing you could do just to be super safe if you wanted to get a tattoo was, if you're in America, ask the artist or the shop you're going to if they use organic, non-toxic inks, and maybe find somewhere that does. For my European audience, different story. You guys can be relatively assured that your inks are going to be safer than the American ones. But at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't seem like there's that detrimental of an effect on your overall health unless you're immunosuppressed or immunocompromised. But yeah, I thought this was very interesting. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If any of you have any fun facts or information about how tattoos are done in your country, or if they're regulated, I'd love to hear them. You can send me an email at thesciencebt@gmail.com. And until next time, I hope you guys have a great week. I'll see you all later. Thanks for listening. Remember, as always, stand up and question everything.